Hi, let's look at the previous questions of UPSC since 1995 to 2021. So I have segregated all these previous questions on the topic wise basis so that it would be easy for me to explain, because most of the concepts when it comes to a common topic would make things better for me. So let's start with the first and foremost question. A consumer is said to be in equilibrium. I guess you understand the meaning of the word called equilibrium. Equilibrium is that point that happens to be common on both the demand and the supply curves. This is how we might have discussed when we discussed about the law of demand and law of supply. So if you look at this particular point, equilibrium, so at this particular point the consumer is happy consuming this amount of quantity of goods at this particular price, and it is the same quantity of goods at this particular price the supplier or the producer is happy selling. That's what we call a equilibrium. But here in this case he is asking a question: a consumer is said to be in equilibrium. So these are the two important terms that you need to keep: consumer and equilibrium. When would a consumer would be in equilibrium? If he is able to fulfill his need with a given level of income. That's the first option. He is able to live in full comforts with a given level of income. He can fulfill his needs without consumption of certain items. He is able to locate new sources of income. So I think you might be aware of the fact by this time that when it comes to UPSC, my friends, though lot many options seems to be relatively okay, I mean they happen to be something very similar, but what exactly UPSC expects from you is the most appropriate answer. So out of all those four options, what seems to be the most appropriate option that explains the phenomena of a consumer's equilibrium? So here in this case, if you look at the first option, what does it say? He is able to fulfill his need with a certain amount of income. So whatever is the necessities, I guess you could recollect the difference between need, want and greed. So need is something that is essential and want is a desire that people are willing to have but not necessary. You could live without having these goods and services. Greed is something you want to have at the cost of other people. So when is a consumer said to be in equilibrium? So a consumer could be said to be in equilibrium if he was able to get all that things necessary for whatever he has, for the amount of money he has with him. And that seems to be the most optional, most better option here in this case. Why? Let's look at why the other option seems to be the most. He is able to live in full comfort. But you know this, my friends, you might have heard the needs, the wants generally, or what I call the comforts, are unlimited. I don't really find a person who simply says, these are the things all that I want in my life and I'm happy with it. No, the wants keeps increasing. Wants are unlimited. So no matter whatever the source of income, you cannot fulfill all your wants or comforts with that at certain amount of income. So henceforth, I don't really think this is a problem. He can fulfill his needs without consumption of certain items. Without consumption of certain items. So what are that certain items? That is something this particular statement is not clear, doesn't it? And henceforth, I don't really think this is the best option. He is able to locate new sources of income. So new sources of income, so that really doesn't explain the consumption perspective. The reason is a consumer's equilibrium matlab, so if he is able to get whatever he needs for the amount of money he has, that's what we ideally call as a consumer's equilibrium. But he is able to look at new sources of income. Okay, but is he able to fulfill what he needs? That is something this particular statement is not explaining, and henceforth the most appropriate answer happens to be A. Now let's look at option. Supply side economics places greater emphasis on the point of view of producer, global economy, consumer, middleman. So in one of the classes with respect to introduction to monetary and fiscal policy, I said the change in price, mostly the price is a function of demand and supply. I'm trying to make things simple. So change in demand, change in supply would influence the prices. And we have discussed that if you want to really bring in stability in prices, you could alter the demand or you could alter the supply. So if you are trying to ensure that the market would be in equilibrium, the market equilibrium would be attained at a particular price, or if you want to address the problem of price stability, we discussed in the previous in the classroom, or in my lecture of introduction to monetary and fiscal policy, we discussed that you could change the supply, you could influence the supply so that your supply of goods and services meets the demand, so that results in bringing stability in prices. Or you could control the demand. So if your actions are influencing the change or supply of goods and services, then I call it a supply side economics. But if the actions of the government would influence the demand side, How could you influence the aggregate demand economy? By altering the interest rates through monetary policy. Similarly, when it comes to fiscal policy, you know the fact that by decreasing tax revenue, tax rates and increasing expenditure, you could influence the demand in the economy, isn't it? So here in this case, the question asked is the supply side economics lays greater emphasis on the point of view, and who would be the supplier of goods and services? Ideally, it's a producer. That's the most appropriate answer. Now let's look at the other question. Consider the following statements. Other things remains unchanged. Market demand of a good might increase. So if you look at, my friends, if you could recollect the law of demand, what is law of demand says? Keeping all things constant. Keeping all things constant. What is the all things constant? Income of an individual constant. Okay, and the taste or preference of the particular person constant, price of substitutes constant, price of complementary goods constant. I guess you could recollect the difference between a substitute and a complement. So the question asked is other things remains unchanged. Market demand for a good might increase. So when would the demand for a good increase? We know it increases with fall in price. This is something very simple to understand. That's what we call law of demand. Demand rises with fall in price and demand decreases with the rise in price. Now here the question asked is other things remains unchanged. Market demand for a good might increase if price of its substitute increases. Let's say take the case of substitutes. The best example of substitute is, let's say, tea and coffee. Substitute has been one could be replaced with the other. One could be easily replaced with the other. So let's look at okay, tea. The demand for tea. And since coffee is a substitute, a near substitute for tea, so let's find out whether the demand for tea changes with change in the price of coffee. Imagine if the price of coffee in the market decreases. What happens when the price of coffee decreases? Obviously, people willingness to consume coffee increases. The demand increases. When the demand for coffee increases, because you get coffee for a really cheap price, that obviously decreases the demand for a tea, isn't it? So if you look at price of coffee increases, what happens? The demand for coffee decreases. And since the coffee has become too costly, that results in people willingness to consume more tea. So hence for the demand for tea in such case would increase. Now let's look at the question again. Other things remains unchanged. Market demand of a good increase if price of substitute increases. Okay, don't you think if the price of substitute increases, the demand for that particular good decreases? As a result, the demand for, here in this case, the other product happens to increase. So option A happens to be right. Price of complement increases. Complement is, so let's say what is the price of complement? I guess you could understand one goes with the other, like a mobile phone and a SIM card, okay, or simply they are mobile accessories, mostly like okay, what you call the battery and all these things. Just imagine, or a pen and a notebook and a pen, isn't it? So that's it with complements. So when you look at the price of a complement, I mean when the price of this particular product increases, price of complement increases, obviously what happens to the demand of this good, because whatever that is required to use a mobile phone is increasing, and it would become very difficult for people, okay, I mean to the price for maintaining or purchasing mobile phone and servicing this mobile phone, I mean using cellular services would increase, and henceforth what happens when the price of complementary goods rises? The demand for that corresponding good, okay, the other good happens to decrease. Henceforth this might not be a right option. The good is an inferior good and income of the consumer increases. Yeah, inferior goods are those goods, my friends, wherein the demand for a commodity decreases with increase in the price of let's say when you are trying to make more money, okay, isn't it? So obviously those people who are having lot of money, they prefer to consume inferior services, let's say road transportation. So how many millionaires you might have come across who use the public transportation services? I mean not sorry, road transportation, public transportation services. So don't you really think this could be an example? I'm not simply, okay, so if you look at in terms of the money, the wealth you possess, higher is the income, lesser would be a preference, and lesser is the consumption of such quality of goods and services. That's what I mean to say. So the good is an inferior good and income of the consumer rises. So when the income of the consumer rises, his preference to consume better sources and better goods would increase rather than these public transport services. Here I'm giving an example. I'm considering this as an inferior with respect to a particular person who is a millionaire or billionaire, isn't it? So in such case, what's your option? Okay, other things remain unchanged. Market demand for a good might increase if the good is an inferior good and income of the consumer decreases. Okay, so henceforth even that doesn't seems to be the right option, isn't it? And now last one happens to be price falls, and you know the law of demand, when prices fall the demand increases. So henceforth 1 and 4 happens to be the correct answer, and A is the most appropriate answer. If a commodity is provided free to the public by the government, so anything in the form of freebies to the government, to the public, freebies to the public, and who is providing it? By the government of India. But what do you call government? Representatives of people, but where does government source the money to offer these freebies? It is from the taxpayer. And who is the taxpayer? The public, the tax-paying public. So imagine if the government has not offered the same X, Y, Z, or okay, something in the form of freebies to the public. The government doesn't need that proportion of tax money to be collected from these people, isn't it? So whatever the tax money the government is collecting from the public has an opportunity cost, isn't it? If the government doesn't collect tax money to spend for these freeways, that money would have been left with these public, and this particular amount of money that this would been with the public might have been spent for some alternative causes. And henceforth, if you look at it, a commodity provided free to the public by the government, the opportunity cost is zero. Do you really think? Okay, in reality, every penny you spend has an opportunity cost, whether the government spends or you spend or an entity spends. Henceforth, this is not the right option. Opportunity cost is ignored. How could it be ignored? Because you have an alternative, or you could make other uses of money. So henceforth, it cannot be ignored. Now let's look at the third option. The opportunity cost is transferred from the consumer to the product to the tax-paying public, and I think this seems to be most appropriate. And let's look at the fourth one. The opportunity cost is transferred from the consumers to the product to the government. No, here in this case, not stopping with the government, because jo bhi paisa government spends is from the taxpayer money, isn't it? Henceforth, it is a public who happens to bear the burden of paying that taxes, which would be spent by the government in the form of freebies. So henceforth, the most appropriate option happens to be the C, and D cannot be the right option. Now the question. Consider the following statements. Human capital formation of a concept is better explained in terms of a process which includes. So maybe you might have come across this term called human capital. So let me make it first with respect to capital. So generally you all have a perception capital refers to only wealth, or capital refers to money, isn't it? But capital refers to anything that is a man-made. Maybe it could be an intellectual property, maybe it could be a technology, maybe a machine, maybe the money that is required to invest. So all this is what we call the capital. But since this capital is preceded by a term called human capital, isn't it? So if you look at many times we categorize the labor force in terms of skilled pool labor, skilled labor force, okay, semi-skilled, unskilled, isn't it? So the skill required to perform a particular job itself is basically that gives the potential to earn certain amount of income to that particular person. So what ideally could be considered as a human capital. So now let's look at human capital formation is a concept better explained in terms of a process which enables individuals of a country to accumulate more capital. No, here in this case, the capital is not referring to the physical capital, it is referring to the individual, human's capital. So this doesn't seem to be the right answer. Increase the knowledge, skill levels and capacity of the people of the country. So this is, the skill development or acquiring more knowledge, isn't it? Proficiency in various jobs that would help in boosting the human capital. And I think if at all you have ever gone through the basic NCERT textbooks, this concept of human capital is very much clear, and this really doesn't need enough time to figure out what exactly is the most appropriate answer. But for those people who have not gone through NCERT, I'm just trying to make it clear. So let's keep this aside, and this seems to be one of our options. Now let's say accumulation of tangible wealth. But since if the word is only capital, then this could be an answer, but it is a human capital, isn't it? So obviously what seems to be the better option is this cannot be the better option, because this is a term that refers to human capital. Accumulation of intangible wealth. But accumulation of intangible wealth, who is accumulating? That's not clear, isn't it? Who is accumulating that intangible wealth? So if it is a individual accumulating intangible wealth, then don't you really think the second option explains the same thing, isn't it? So imagine if I happen to be the person who acquires that skill set and the knowledge, that's what is an intangible wealth of mine. And what is my tangible wealth? The land I own, the capital I own, the investments I have made, isn't it? That's my tangible wealth. But here in this case, the statement says accumulation of intangible wealth. What is that intangible wealth? Let's say, intellectual property of a person could be an intangible wealth. But don't you really think the same thing is what is being part of the second option? And here in this case, who is accumulating intangible wealth? That's not clear. but here in this case increasing knowledge, skill levels and capacity of the people of the country, isn't it? So it's been perfectly explained and who are the people who are acquiring these particular skill sets, and henceforth, okay, if you have been any confusion between B and C, I would say the B happens to be the most appropriate answer, because okay, B happens to be the simplest definition, and that results, okay, that explains everything that is referring a human capital, and you don't really need, okay, the option 4. The reason is it's not a complete, and even though it happens to, okay, explain that it's with respect to people, but the statement 2 refers the same, and henceforth the most appropriate option is B. Despite being a high saving in the economy, capital formation may not result in significant increase in output. So these are two words, high savings and capital formation. And you know, when the savings rate in a economy is high, does mean the interest rates would be low, because many people have money to lend, and when interest rates are low, people's preference to borrow and invest or borrow and spend would increase, isn't it? So now question here in this case is, despite of high savings, why is the capital formation in an economy? So when it comes to capital formation, don't look at the previous question. There it is a human capital, but here in this case we are generally referring to the capital. So it could be a machinery, it could be technology, it could be the wealth, that the man-made wealth that generated in a country. It may not result in a significant increase in output, may not result in a significant output. Why is it so? Let's look at the options. Weak administrative machinery, maybe this could be one reason. But here in this case, you are not being given options like 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4. So let's try to find out of all these 4 options which seems to be the best option. Because imagine if you are a manager of a company and you have one of the worst administration skills, and you don't know how to transform the wealth into some assets, how to transform the investments, and how to transform the raw materials perfectly into various goods and services. So the weak machinery, okay, administration would many times results in disproportionate uses of wealth, isn't it? Wastage of wealth and wastage of resources. Maybe that results in a less output. This could be, but let's look at if you have any other better option. Illiteracy. Okay, so illiteracy, maybe illiteracy could also be, because when you have a large scale illiteracy, though you have higher savings, you have enough capital, you cannot make use of the resources and come up with a better output. Okay, and high population density, high population density, in fact to an extent it also says this is a labor surplus economy, and you have an advantage of using labor surplus economy. But let's look at the 4th option, high capital output ratio. So what is a capital output ratio? High capital output ratio does mean, what do you mean by high capital output ratio? In fact, what exactly is the meaning of high capital? It simply says the amount of money, the capital that you need to require, that you need to produce a unit output. Let's say, imagine if you, okay, require 100 rupees of investment to produce an output rupees worth 10. Does mean, okay, this is an option A, and there is someone who is able to generate the same output at rupees 10 by simply investing an amount of 50. So the capital you invested is 100 to generate an output worth rupees 10. The capital your competitor invests is 50, but he is also generating the same output which is also worth rupees 10. Now tell me, who is more efficient in production of goods and services, your competitor than comparatively? So I could say in this case the simplest way, that the capital you are using to produce a certain amount of output is much higher than compared to what your competitor is doing. So this inefficiency in production of goods and services, okay, might result in fall in your output. And if you look at out of all these 4 options, the last one explains every problem. In fact, the reason why the high capital that is required to produce output is high, maybe it could have a bad administration, maybe because you don't have enough resources, maybe you don't have enough technology to transform these goods and services better, maybe you are going for excessive labor surplus, okay, labor intensive production where you have a better alternatives, isn't it? So henceforth the option D happens to be the most appropriate, because this explains everything. That's a comprehensive, okay, reason why most of the time a country or an economy ends up producing relatively less output than compared to the capital employed. So henceforth I will go for D, the most appropriate. So these are the questions that is with respect to the very basics of economics, and the next topic we will be discussing is about measures of national income and growth. Thank you.